In this chapter, we're going to identify the benefits and drawbacks of mediated communication. We are going to try to distinguish between mediated interpersonal and mass-personal communication and how they both can be used appropriately and benefit your exchanges. We're also going to look at how to apply the principles of competence to your mediated interpersonal and mass-personal communication. We're going to look at the pros and cons of mediated communication and what's the difference between mediated and mass-personal communication. And as mentioned, how does this influence your journey of becoming a competent communicator? Briefly, I've highlighted these objectives to identify the benefits and the drawbacks of mediated communication, distinguish between interpersonal and mass-personal communication, and how to apply the principles. So mediated communication, when we think about the history of communication, we first think about face-to-face communication, and that's the foundation of interpersonal exchanges, being able to communicate face-to-face. Proximity is very important in these relationships, and using technology, we can consider or overcome some of these spatial limitations, how we communicated in the past, and today we use mediated communication every day. It's quite overwhelming sometimes, but there are forms of mediated communication through technology, through social media, through means of communication, not just texting, but in addition to that, we use Instagram, Twitter, etc., whatever those social media tools are. So we're going to consider how these tools either alienate us in communication or bring us together, or can we find a happy balance? So some of those past stories about communication. So we've learned that in some of the communication from the past, we don't have a way to reflect on it once it's already occurred, right? So once we have interpersonal communication, it's communicated once, it can't be repeated. We learned a little bit about that in the previous chapter. So through technology, there seems to be more of a permanence in our communication. So let's look at that. Are those positive or negatives? Are we being alienated when we're using mediated communication? Or are we increasing connections? Is it bringing people closer together through mediated communication, or are we distancing? So there are multiple approaches to looking at this topic, and there are a lot of debates about mediated communication, whether it's more beneficial to create connections, or is it really alienating us? There are multiple arguments out of multiple platforms in the research of this phenomena. So we read in chapter 1 about loneliness and how it can impact our health. And so technology, while it is identified, I think initially as an alienating approach to interpersonal communication, that face-to-face is better, there is a correlation that has been found through social interaction and loneliness. So you're not getting those nonverbal cues that you would get in face-to-face. You're not getting the exchanges right away. So while many of our teens and many of you have become accustomed to using mediated communication for day-to-day, what are some of those vicious cycles that we get caught up in? Is it a negative spiral? How does the smartphones intrude on our day-to-day lives? And how do these intrusions affect the quality of our relationships? So as we navigate further into this chapter, I wanted to build on the previous chapter. Each chapter will build on, but as you're listening and taking notes, I want you to write down thoughts that come to you about yourself. Because at the end of this class, you're going to have to write a paper about your journey. You're also going to have to utilize terms that you've learned in the class, but I think these notes will be helpful. So as I'm lecturing in these online deliveries, I want you to stop and pause and think about maybe how what I'm reflecting on impacted you, maybe today or yesterday, or maybe you have a message in draft form that you're holding on to because you want to respond to someone. In our face-to-face interactions, we don't have that flexibility. So there is a benefit maybe to mediated communication. So there are some alienation factors that are important to consider. And if you can take a moment and watch this video, I forgot my phone, to just think about what's happening in this short clip. Jot down some notes. Have you ever felt this way? Do you recall a situation that you've been in? And oh, by the way, if this link is not working, can you please let me know? Just drop me a note in Canvas in message. You should be able to use your control key and select the video link and it should play. So we get caught up in this vicious cycle that I mentioned. So as you watch this video, how do you feel when this occurs, when you're with your friends or family or your coworkers? What happens when you're trying to communicate to someone and they're on their phone? How do you perceive what togetherness means anymore when everybody's on their phone? Have you found a way to address this with others? Is it comfortable? Is it uncomfortable for you? So mediated communication and connections. Again, keeping in mind that interpersonal is that face-to-face exchange. Think about the interpersonal communication process model. So we are supplementing our face-to-face interaction. We're creating relationships a little differently, and we want to be able to adjust to these changes. We want them to be meaningful. So in social media, or the discovery of using, let's say, computers, right, to communicate, because basically that's what our phones are. They're mini computers that we use. And so I don't know that it was so much intended to replace the face-to-face, but maybe it was intended to increase the amount of communication so we could stay in touch more frequently. We can stay in touch through different modalities that are available, through videos, through just there's just so many different options. I'm thinking about WhatsApp, I'm thinking about Zoom, I'm thinking about Messenger. Those are some of the modalities that I use. But how mediated communication has helped me in my relationships? Yes, it's developed connecting factors because I can easily connect with my family in Central America or family across the US. So I can see where it can be very beneficial. Or just recently we had the pandemic. Um, well, it's not so recent anymore, but it was not too far in the past. Uh, we relied so much on being able to stay connected when we were sheltering at home. So social media helped many people feel like the world wasn't so small, that they weren't alone. It helped them escape from depression of being isolated. So there is a connectivity positiveness to using digital communication or mediated communication to connect with others. Nearly 2/3 of teens say that they have made new friends online and they engage in online groups. I mean, I personally engage in a couple of groups that of interest, and we connect with people from all over the world online. So mediated communication has enhanced my way of communicating. But I also have to keep in mind my boundaries and how I'm sustaining connections, not just in romantic relationships, but in relationships in general. Are my connections superficial, or are they meaningful? So as we go through and connect with people, we need to consider what's the connection? Is it meaningful? Um, I can tell many stories of connections that I've had with people from my past that may have found me, say, through Facebook or Instagram, and they want to reconnect. And it was kind of a safe zone for me. I mean, being that I'm in my 6th decade of my life, so we're talking about a lot of years there. And some of the individuals, I don't know that I wanted to meet face to face. And over time, the mediated communication just dwindled and stopped. So it was kind of a safe way for me. And not wanting to be rude and reject people, it just kind of fizzled out on its own. So regardless of how many online friend users or how we maintain those relationships, it's important to consider, are those relationships meaningful or superficial? So just keep that in mind, because there's pros and cons. In mediated communication, it can be a way to strengthen a relationship. I think about how my son and I may be talking on the phone. He lives in another state, and let's say we disagree on something or we have an argument about something. I can say, hey, can we revisit this later? It's a little bit of an escape for me, but it helps me think about what's going on. And then maybe I'll start a text message conversation, kind of relieving some of the stress through the texting. Being considerate of what I'm saying gives me a little more time to think about how I want to say something. And then we reconnect again on a phone call, maybe in a day or two. So it has helped in developing, strengthening my relationships in a meaningful manner. So considering those superficial points, is the communication richer in the connection? Can it be achieved online? I believe it can. I just think we have to be competent in our use of mediated communication. What do you think? Think about it. Write it down. So in the meaningfulness aspect of mediated communication, we can see that um, we connect through like-mindedness, through strengthening our existing relationships, building our social capital. Let's say you're trying to build a brand and you need that connection, and you can't reach all these people face to face. When we think about how many followers somebody might have on Instagram, oh my goodness, there's no way you could reach 1 million people in just one instance. So it's just a great tool if you know how to use it, right? So just consider how you're using it and when you're using it. And when you reflect on the short video in the previous slides, think about what you're doing when you're present. Are you being present? Let's not lose that connectedness in our interpersonal interactions. So what effects might smartphones have on ourselves, not just teens, but on ourselves? Can it cause loneliness, depression? Are teens, meaning young teens, I'm thinking about middle school aged to high school, how is it impacting them? And I can see that there are some unhealthy aspects of those connections, and there are some dangers that we hopefully are all aware of. So there was some research that found links between social media and suicidal connection. Um, there's studies shared in your textbook when some individuals rely heavily on media responses that have led many young people to depression and loneliness because they didn't get the feedback that they wanted. So there's some effects that impact mediated communication. So those hazards can be very dangerous. So in your textbook, the 16th edition, let me see what page this was. I apologize, I should have had this ready. It's on page 38 of the 16th edition. Now, if you don't have the 16th edition, I will try my best to highlight what this research was about. So it was a social media detox research, and they discovered through the study, they had installed some apps on phones, and they identified participants' use of the phones and their behaviors through various modalities. Um, the goal was, how did these individuals react when their phones were taken away? And they discovered that 59%, so a good majority of them, really struggled not having the connection through their phones. So the research basically confirmed that there is a basic importance of social media in our daily lives, but we also need to find a balance. We need to look at qualitative explorations of our communication. What is the quality of that? So this research was very interesting. And thinking about yourself and how you use your social media is important. So finding a balance, using it in moderation. Um, think about what you're doing, what you're scrolling through, the content that you're looking at. Are you doing this alone? Are you doing this with friends? Are you creating your own content to be more connected? Why are you using it? Are you being passive? Are you being active in your involvement? And also, are you communicating with a general public that you don't even know? So you want to think about what is your advantage and what are some of the disadvantages that you are gaining from social media and mediated communication. So it's clear that mediated communication can be a tool to enhance your interpersonal relationships as long as it's monitored. So there are some weaknesses to it and there are some strong ties to it. So we're not saying that it's bad. How do we balance it? And any parents out there, keep that in mind. It's not just negative, but help teach your children to balance it. And if you're an independent young adult, monitor yourself and try to find a healthy balance. Well, we're not going to have a discussion, but I'd like you to think about the pros and cons of this. Look at your recent messages on your phone. Would you have said those things in person or not? Maybe go through the last 25 texts that you've sent out. Do a little research on it and maybe set up a column. And one would be, yes, I would do the same thing in face-to-face, or the column on the right, no, I would not. And put check marks and see if you would do them all face-to-face as you did in the text message or not, and take a look at what your habits are. How are you using mediated communication? We've talked about, the pros and cons in whether it's healthy or unhealthy, and we did discover that, it can improve. It can improve our communication, but we've got to have a balance. We've got to be able to consider how we're sending our information out and the expectation of the reciprocation, because oftentimes we don't get reciprocation. So, what is healthy mediated communication? Being able to maintain and develop positive connections. So, thinking about the I'd say the hallmarks, right? What are the differences here? What's important? Being able to have a balance in that personal content, knowing when you're reaching a larger audience, or just maintaining some privacy. So it's important that we understand mass mediated interpersonal and mass personal communication. So some of the mass communication, uh, and the mass communication is how we use mediated communication to reach a large audience. So when it's one-on-one, we're talking on that interpersonal. When we're talking about mass communication, we're starting to move into a larger group. So to close here with just the mediated communication in general, we can see where it has its benefits in a positive and a negative way. Some of the unhealthy things in our individual mediated communication is as we're scrolling, we can't put our phone down, we can't focus until we have our phone. Where's my phone? Some people will drive an hour back to their house just to get their phone. And I've been a victim of that. I no longer do that. If I don't have my phone, I just go and take care of business and leave my phone where it is. I do rely on my phone because that's how I get directions. I grew up in an era where I learned how to use maps, paper maps, But some of you have probably never even looked at a paper map. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the times and when you were born. So the unhealthy part of mediated communication can be depression, loneliness, that social anxiety. Your self-esteem can be diminished, or you can have an increased false identity. So there's not a good balance sometimes, and it could create a lack of well-being. So think about how you're using your communication and having a balance with your face-to-face. How are you using it? Think about it, write it down. Would you prefer to communicate via your texting or messaging? And if so, why? Are you avoiding face-to-face? Or did you grow up in a generation where over the past 8 years, that's how people communicate? But how does that impact you professionally? Are you going to be able to grow in your career without that tool of not having the mediated in your hand constantly? I mean, we even have sunglasses that provide our communication tool. So it's moving very quickly. So kind of highlighting back on mass communication, just to kind of bring that back to where we were. Mass personal messages will help you reach larger audiences. And that's a great way. Like I said earlier, I couldn't reach 1,000 people or 1,000,000 people with one message. That would take years for me to do in the past, but now it's just a click and you're reaching a larger audience. So what is the bottom line here? We're trying to find balance. Social media is not all bad, just like anything else. When we had face-to-face communication being our comfort zone, we did have the introduction of a home telephone, a landline, and that started to develop a change in how our interpersonal relationships occurred. Now we've increased that, right? So what are some of the moderations? Think about how you're using it, how you're communicating professionally, personally. I know that I have some interesting interactions through Canvas inbox, and as I discover on our Tuesday office hours, my numbers have declined over the past 4 or 5 years. Not very many students want to communicate on Zoom or turn their cameras on. Many of you are much more comfortable having your cameras off. And I think we need to challenge ourselves and get back to more of that interpersonal through mediated communication. A thought to consider: social media users who interact with those they know offline fare better with depression than those who mainly follow strangers. That logically makes sense because you have the interpersonal connection. What do you think? So phone calls and texting are positively correlated with well-being, where gaming, say, being in a game where there's some social interaction, may not necessarily be correlated with a more positive. That could be challenged. I'm not well versed on that research, but I've seen some kids interacting, not always my preference of conversation, but there's some kind of connection going on. think about those things in your own life or the life of the children that you have in your life, or even at work. How does that impact you? Some of you may have remote jobs, and that's what I have. I have a remote job, and I interact through social media. I interact through recording my videos to you, sending messages. It's very rare that I have more than 2 of you show up on office hours on Tuesday. So I think we're moving towards this interaction through media, which is great, but keeping it balanced is so important. I think we need to keep that interpersonal component, have some face-to-face exchange, get some experience interpreting nonverbal messages, not using perception per se to judge, but perception to gain more understanding. So on this slide, we are looking at the connections or types of communication. When we look at mass communication on the top left, it's more of a public. And if we're looking at mass communication, when it's a tailored message or a group message, it's more of a private, still impersonal, not as interpersonal, but it is a mass communication. So a mass personal communication over on the right, you're going to have like Instagram, right, or Twitter, or other social media platforms or tools, if you will, that go to a larger group. But then as we move more towards the personal, we're going to find that different categories such as a directed tweet or a directed online dating message or just a private message is going to be much more on the personal side. So as we review the slide, we can see interpersonal is much more personal. Mass personal does have a personal content, as we saw in the previous slide, but in interpersonal versus mass personal, the number of people is different. There's a less obligation when you're in the mass personal. Your message goes out to the 1 million, where interpersonal, it's going out mostly to 1 or 2 individuals. And the obligation is not as great when you're sending it to a mass group. And on the interpersonal, there's much more of a mutual obligation and much more privacy involved. The expectation of privacy is greater in the interpersonal interaction, whereas the mass personal, it is honestly, there's no privacy because you're sending out to the masses. So are your personal messages deeply revealing or not? Are you oversharing online? Are you obnoxious online? What is the difference for you personally when you're sending messages out? I think about this being a year of a lot of content in our nation, a lot of content because of the differences in our policies, what we believe in, what we don't believe in, who we're going to vote for, what we should do or not do. There's just so much happening right now that in the mass communication, it is impacting us in such great ways. I think that the way that mass media is used can greatly influence what we think about individuals, what we think about our leaders for our country. It's just incredible to me. So just remember that, choosing between interpersonal or mass personal channels, it can make a big difference on how your message is received or how consequences follow. So make the right decision on when you're sending a message. I like that some phones and most email platforms allow you to delay or schedule a message or hold a message in draft so that you can take some time to think about what it is that you're saying. But in the face-to-face, we don't always have that unless you request for a break. Can I take a moment to think about that, or can I get back to you with that? So I'd like you to think about someone that you know who posts positive in mediated environments. Do you believe that that impacts the person personally, and how does it impact other people? Do you think it's a good habit, a bad habit? There might be somebody that does the opposite. Oftentimes in mediated communication, we're just scrolling through, reading, sharing, forwarding. I get so many forwarded messages. Sometimes it's just annoying because I want more of a private interaction. Do you feel that way? Why don't you jot some of those things down so that you can reflect on them if you have to write a reflection essay or even a concept analysis. You can use these ideas for some of that writing. Take a moment to read this slide and consider its points. How can mass personal messages strengthen your interpersonal relationships and build support? Are there risks involved? So I think that mass personal communication can have a positive impact. We just have to consider the message. Consider the channel that we're using. Is the message rich or is it lean? So when we think about the nonverbal cues not being available, we're losing some of the richness in our mass communication. What about the like buttons? Do you go through and just like? Sometimes I break my own rules because I'll just like something so somebody's feelings may not be hurt. Or if I see someone that's only got one like, I'll like again just so they have more than one. Oh, that's kind of terrible to hear myself say that, but honestly, that's what I do. What about you? Do you have any rules? Do you have any boundaries for yourself when using social media? As we develop our communication competence, we must include our competence with mediated communication. So I mentioned briefly about richness. In mediated communication, we lose some of the richness because we can't see those nonverbal cues. It's much more leaner because the message carries less information, right? So we don't have that richness. We can't consider if somebody's angry or not in their tone. It's kind of hard to read. Well, you're not always right, but I can tell in a conversation, even though we're not face to face, I can pick up a little more on the tone. So in texting, even online posts, that's very lean. That's a channel that's very lean. When you think about a phone call, it's not as lean, it's going more towards a richer, but it's still on the lean side. When you think about, FaceTiming or Zoom or video conferencing, Teams, things such as those tools, you're going to be able to have a much more richer interaction. And of course, in person or face to face is completely richer. So I think that we want to consider our conversations, consider our communication with others, develop our competence. Your textbook also offers some great references to how leanness, without the nonverbal cues, can sometimes make these interactions very unrealistic. And here is that leanness, richness spectrum that I was just talking about, how text messaging is leaner and in person is much more richer. Just a challenge here for you, not required, but interesting for your own growth, to create a chart of 5 people in your life and what is the primary means of communication? Is it rich? Is it lean? Do you text more? And describe why your communication channel works or doesn't work. Do you need to change the channel from a leaner channel to a richer channel? Just another challenge for you as we develop our competence. It's important to look at these details. And again, if you do this challenge, put it in your notes and reflect on it. Put a little asterisk by it if you like the outcome, because you can use it in your analysis, you can use it in your final project essay. So synchronous communication is in real time. So it's more of an in-person. It could fall under an online chat because you're connecting back and forth synchronously. You're not sending a text and then whenever that person is available to respond. So there are some online chats that are considered synchronous. Asynchronous communication is when there's a lag. So we are communicating asynchronous because I'm not getting feedback from you live. So there can be maybe tweets or emails that would be considered asynchronous. So there are benefits. So in asynchronous channels, it gives you the opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, to edit, kind of put things in draft mode. It's useful when your emotions are high. Asynchronous can be very beneficial, especially if you have to apologize. Asynchronous is a great way to communicate. It gives you a little break. In face-to-face, honestly, you're not always going to have that available. While you can have a quick reflection, it just takes time. Just remember that when you're posting, that it's pretty permanent, just like in face-to-face. Because once you say it, as we mentioned earlier, that in chapter 1, that it's permanent, it's non-repeatable, you can't take it back. So in our communication, mediated communication, we do run into that same challenge. So, you do need to be careful what you post. You have to think about privacy. You have to think about your tone, the words, your syntax, your commas, exclamation points, your just the way you're laying things out, capitals, upper and lower case, all of those come into play. but also thinking about what you're saying, because once it's out there permanently. And you don't want to embarrass yourself, you don't want to embarrass others. We do have to consider the environments, we have to consider potential employers, we have to consider types of messages that we're sharing. I can't remember, somewhere I've seen a commercial where someone's interviewing for a job, and one of the questions is, I was looking online and I found this, and this person said, oh my God, that was from college, I can't believe it. So just be very careful what you're putting out there. So just remember that competence in our journey. We're developing our communication skills. We want to be competent communicators. Mediated communication is not all bad. It's understanding boundaries, privacy boundaries, using it as a beneficial tool. So remember, mass personal communication is great when you're trying to reach a large group of people, when you're building your brand, trying to get a message out. It's so great. It really is. But is it well intentioned? What is your purpose? So think about just a challenge. Have you experienced any mass personal messages that you've sent out that may have had some unexpected results? Maybe you didn't expect it to go off negative, and then you started getting all this negative feedback. That can be so devastating. But I know of stories where that's happened, and it just makes me sad, especially with the teenagers that I interact with. It can be just very challenging. Have you had an experience like that, or know somebody that's had an experience? Just think about it. I believe in your discussion for this week, there is an ethical challenge that might deal with some of these topics. Possibly, I'm not sure, but I will challenge you to think about it. So take the time to check your own messages. Take the time of doing that challenge I mentioned earlier. Would you be able to send that message the same way you did online or as a text in person? Do you see your messages with a clear answer, or a yes or a no? Are you being clear in what you are saying? Think about it. I often have a challenge with Canvas Inbox. So that's a tool of mediated communication where someone will send me a message and they'll say, I can't see that assignment. Well, I don't know what assignment you're talking about, and it's not a clear message. I need to know, what assignment specifically are you talking about? Be specific in your mediated communication. It makes such a difference, because if we're face to face, I can ask you these questions. But if you're just sending vague messages, it makes it very difficult. I don't interact with all of you on a day-to-day. I don't know what your needs are. I don't know what your circumstances are. So I need you to fill me in. So in the subject of your message, maybe put week 3 short essay, or week 3 lecture question, just so that I can focus my thoughts on what you need exactly. This is a really wonderful and also very challenging video to watch. I'd like to challenge you to watch it. As you see the mediated messages, as you hear the mediated messages being delivered, and once the messages get a little harsher, much more on the negative side. The interaction between these two individuals face to face becomes even harder, which to me proves that there are certain statements that we would not say face to face. And our mediated communication serves as a negative tool in these circumstances. It's really sad. We see it all the time. We see it all the time on everything that's challenging in our world. It's when I read about some of the different things that people say to each other because their beliefs are different, it's expressed more in a email, text message, or a post, and that really grieves me. I would like to see more interpersonal, more richer interactions. So I hope you enjoy this video, Women in Sports That Face Harassment. And again, remember, jot down notes because you may have gained something really great after you watch this. Jot down your notes, put a little asterisk in your notes so that you can come back to it. Make a note that it's in video chapter 2, lecture video, and you may want to come back and use it in your papers later in the semester. So let's consider some competence in our mediated communication. So consider the receiver's preference. Use multiple modalities, different channels. Don't just stick to one channel. Respect others and their needs. Provide undivided attention. Be mindful and balance your face-to-face and your mediated communication. This is so important in becoming a competent communicator. How multimodal are you? Are you using different channels of communication? And if you aren't, why not? What is causing you to resist that? Is it have something to do with your identity? Does it have something to do with something that holds you back? Challenge yourself. To be a competent communicator, we need to step outside of our comfort zones so that we can have much more success for our future. Is it hard for you to leave your phone? Can you challenge yourself to step away from your phone or whatever tool you use to communicate with others? When someone's talking to you and your phone rings, do you answer it in the middle of the conversation? Or do you turn your phone off so you can give your friend or your family member that undivided attention when they're talking to you? What is it that you do? Check yourself. So in this chapter, we looked briefly at the benefits and the drawbacks of mediated communication, how we can distinguish between mediated interpersonal and mass personal communication, and how would you apply these principles so that you can become a more competent communicator in your mediated interpersonal and your mass personal communication. Our goal on this journey this semester is to become a more competent communicator. So where we started 2 weeks ago and where we are today, has your competency started to change a little bit? Are you starting to think about, maybe I may want to change that because it's impacting my relationship? Or you might want to keep it that way. I look forward to your input and your feedback. And remember, you can reach me through Canvas inbox. Just use clear communication. Help me to help you. So the more information and details you provide me, the better my response will be and the quicker we can get it resolved. I look forward to seeing some of you on Tuesdays Again, it is not required for you to show up for office hours, but if you have a minute that you're free, jump in and say hi so I can meet you. And again, another reminder, be sure to schedule your reservation for your self-introduction speech. Chat soon.